Thank you, and I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time today to allow me to share with you our approach to culinary medicine. Currently in the United States, the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in the death of over 250,000 Americans. Because of that, we've enforced lockdowns, restricted travel, suffered economic hardship, suffered shortages, and in many ways fundamentally upended aspects and freedoms of society so commonplace that we previously took them for granted. Just 1 year ago, diabetes and its complications were responsible for almost 300,000 deaths in the United States. This induced no fear of urgency and certainly no consensus to leverage resources for a solution at warp speed. Diabetes continues to affect roughly 15% of the US population, or about 5 million people. Diabetes and its complications are the third leading cause of death, being responsible for 12% of all deaths in America. Roughly 90 to 95% of the cases of diabetes are type 2 diabetes. And according to the experts, 90% of type 2 diabetes cases are preventable with lifestyle modification. Recent studies have demonstrated that over 60% of people who already suffer from type 2 diabetes can reverse their condition with such everyday adjustments. But when it comes to addressing diet and health and reaching these greener shores, our ship has run aground. And we have floundered not just with obesity and diabetes, but with the whole gamut of diet-related disabilities and diseases. This includes cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, and strokes. That is the #1 cause of death in the United States and most industrialized nations. I ask you to think of 3 people that you know. One of the 3 of them will die from cardiovascular disease. Yet, data suggests that 8 out of every 10 or 80% of these fatalities are likewise preventable. Given that not one of the 195 countries on the entire planet that has seen the epidemic rise in obesity and type 2 diabetes has been able to reverse it, this raises the question as to why we have so epically failed. And failed we have because I certainly know that I have failed. Failed not only my patients, but my colleague and even myself. How can we help people so enjoy healthful food that they seek it out on their own? How can we lead by example in a world of easy, cheap, and enslaving options? Culinary medicine is that gateway. Culinary medicine is the gateway to restore our relationship with the food we eat. I'd like you to recall a moment when you were forced to eat something because you were told it was good for you. Now, maybe it was broccoli or Brussels sprouts and your mom said you had to eat your greens. Maybe it was endless bowls of plain white rice as part of an elimination diet. Whatever it was. Think about how you felt when you had to eat specifically for a purpose. It became work. And although I'm not a gambling man, I bet the whole experience was less than pleasant. That is how we dictate to people to eat for health and wellness. We admonish them that they must eat to live. But chefs like me are keen to an obvious something that has escaped most of us with scientific blinders. Most people don't consider eating an act of work. Never have, never will. As social primates, the ritual of food has become as interwoven in our DNA as our blood type. This occurred the moment the first chefs crafted those first mastodon burgers, and we all gathered around the fire to listen to the very first stories. There, under the deep velvet night of this African savanna sky, we felt the warmth and protection of fire and fellowship and food. Snug with our full bellies, there was no going back. For the human species, eating is an all-encompassing food experience. Sharing the food experience is social currency and mating ritual. Eating is fun. Eating is about pleasure. Eating is play. We are the only species on the planet that takes the time to prepare and cook our food. As Homo sapiens sapiens, we live to eat. Now come back with me and turn the clock back a half a century to the 1970s. It was a time of bad fashion, bad dance moves, and apparently bad science. The guidelines and dietary fat intake that the US adopted at that time recommended a low total fat, 30% of total energy, and low saturated fat, less than 10% of total dietary energy approach. Today, the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association recommend an even lower level of saturated fat intake. Yet the original trials that launched that ship examined an aggregate number of less than 2,500 people, and they were all, mostly Caucasian, males. There was a total of 6 trials, of which 5 were secondary prevention studies. Not one study examined the regimen of the recommended guidelines. Between the treatment groups and the control groups, there was no significant differences in all-cause mortality or coronary heart disease mortality. Yet, and I quote, the reductions in mean serum cholesterol levels were significantly higher in the intervention groups. In other words, cholesterol levels dropped in the groups undergoing treatment, but there was no difference in mortality. No lives were saved. The result was, and I quote, that dietary recommendations were introduced for 220 million US and 56 million UK citizens by 1983 in the absence of supporting evidence from randomized controlled trials. Many of the hypotheses and theories that we once espoused, and the public still clings to, have proven to be poorly vetted. The saturated fat, dietary cholesterol, heart disease hypothesis upon which the previous governmental recommendations were issued was horribly flawed. The entire premise rests on the basis of the landmark publication of Ansel Keys' 7-country studies conducted in the late 1950s, but not published until 1970. The problems, which arose posthumously, center around collected data on over 20 other countries where the findings don't support Keys' notions that saturated fat causes heart attacks. The 7 countries study itself, and I quote, ultimately did not find a significant correlation between total fat and heart disease. And even when scientists correctly attempt to apply brakes, politics emerge. During the Senate hearings of the 1970s, in response to Dr. Olson, the lead researcher who asked for more time to collect and properly evaluate the findings, Senator McGovern remarked, "Senators don't have the luxury the research scientist does of waiting till every last shred of evidence is in." Now, with such a damn the torpedoes attitude, it is no surprise that we run aground in regards to dietary recommendations and health. And further muddying the waters is the issue of corporate influence. While it's a problem of increasing prevalence and magnitude today, with annual sales of corporations like McDonald's exceeding the GDP of many countries, if McDonald's were a country, it would have the 90th largest economy in the world. The roots go back over half a century. Unearthed only a few years ago, documents show that, as published in the New York Times, and I quote, a trade group called the Sugar Research Foundation, known today as the Sugar Association, paid 3 Harvard scientists the equivalent of about $50,000 in today's dollars to publish a 1967 review of research on sugar, fat, and heart disease. The studies used in the review were handpicked by the Sugar Group, and the article, which was published in the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine, minimized the link between sugar and heart health and cast aspersions on the role of saturated fat. And other examples abound, but they are the symptoms of the disease, not the cause. While the way we metabolize food has not changed over hundreds of thousands of years, our food and food pathways have been horribly transformed. Our relationship has been altered, and not for the better. Like a spouse trapped in an abusive relationship, we continue to make excuses and shift the blame elsewhere. Perhaps nothing exemplifies the error of our ways more than the power of simple observation. In the early days of nutrition, when dealing mainly with deficiency diseases like scurvy, a one object, one effect approach worked very well. For example, identifying a vitamin like vitamin C and its corresponding effect led to the eradication of scurvy and many other deficiency diseases in a very short amount of time. However, this one object, one effect approach wholly fails in the face of multifactorial chronic disability and disease that started to emerge in the decades following World War II. Instead of acknowledging the error, learning the lesson, and correcting course when empirical scrutiny failed to match prediction, we simply toss them into a bin labeled curiosities, conundrums, and paradoxes. Let us take a moment to unpack a few of these paradoxes together. The obesity paradox. While at the very extremes, the hypothesis holds true, study after study suggests that the healthiest population is what is considered overweight, and that class 1 or mild obesity has the same risk as what we term the ideal weight group. Interpretation? Within a wide range, it's not the weight per se that confers a risk. The French paradox. A population consuming a diet high in saturated fats from such sources as butter and drinking alcohol in the form of wine had 1/2 the cardiovascular event rate of that seen in the United States at the time. Yet the consumption of such foods in the US was statistically significantly lower. To add to the mystery, the healthiest area of France was Gascony. Here, more than anywhere else on earth, they produce and consume foie gras. Foie gras is the fatty goose liver that is the poster child for everything we were told not to eat at the time. Their cardiovascular event rate in Gascony was 25% of that seen in the United States. Interpretation: it's not the consumption of fats or the drinking of moderate amounts of wine that confer risk. The Inuit paradox: the native peoples of the North who consume a traditional diet have an event rate roughly half that seen in the United States. They rarely consume any vegetables and fruit, subsisting mostly on meat, including fat, fish, and seafood. Interpretation: it's not the consumption of large amounts of fruits and vegetables that confer benefit. The poor paradox: poor rural children in Africa demonstrate greater gut microbe diversity and a preponderance of strains associated with good health versus wealthier, more urban children in Europe. Interpretation: money cannot only not buy you love, it apparently can't buy you good health either. The blue zones: extensive investigation into areas around the globe that harbor exceptionally high percentages of the population that are over 100 years old and retain both physical and mental health well into these advanced years has yielded no predilection for any particular race or, despite what we might see on the late night infomercial or in the latest Facebook ad, a superfood or diet. Interpretation: there is no singular collection of superior genetics nor miracle superfood that confers health, wellness, longevity, and happiness. The remarkable thread within this tapestry of outliers and outcasts is that a healthy relationship with the food we eat begins with healthful food. And it's not complicated. Healthful food is simply real food. With real food, we don't worry about the ingredients because real food, they are the real ingredients. Within this self-same tapestry, we can see that this relationship with food sets the templates for other relationships in our lives. And what do I mean by that? Well, it starts with our relationship with ourselves. Our spiritual, emotional, and physical health is intricately tied to what we eat from the moment we bond with our mothers over breast or bottle. And it is a moment that will affect us for the rest of our lives. And within the personal space of that connection between what we eat and who we are, if that basic affair is not in proper order, none of our affairs will be. As we have learned from the Harvard Happiness Study, it is the quality, specifically not the quantity, of these relationships in our lives that determines the health, wellness, longevity, and happiness more than any other variable or influence. Culinary medicine is born from this quantum change in our perspective regarding what we eat and who we are. Culinary medicine, as we define and teach it at the University of Montana, is the multidisciplinary application of evidence-based decision-making in the selection of ingredients and techniques used in preparing foodstuffs with a goal of achieving and maintaining health and wellness through an optimized food experience. The goal of culinary medicine is to change our individual relationship to the food experience. The goal of culinary medicine is to empower the individual to positively reestablish, reconnect, and repair their relationship to their food experience, because this food relationship is the cornerstone for all the other relationships in our lives. Yet despite the new connections and shocking patterns that emerge from the reweaving of these disconnected remnants today, all I had just over a decade ago was theory. I was at the time beyond the pale because theory precedes discovery. And then a strange thing began to happen. I noticed that the predictions and observations I had made those many years ago were gaining credence. An email arrived discussing the success they had in Brazil by developing the NOVA classification. This approach assesses the risk of illness associated with diet by the level of food processing and ultra processing, not by arbitrary category and classification like red meat that has little valid contemporary meaning. Nutrigenomics emerged, providing through the science of single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, individually unique collections of point mutations, a solid footing for the rationale behind focusing on an individually tailored dietary regimen. The gut microbiome, long ignored as a commensal evolutionary anachronism, exploded onto the scene. So potent, pervasive, and constant are its effects that it is now considered a symbiotic organ. Foods previously believed to be benign, even more healthful than naturally occurring alternatives like zero-calorie artificial sweeteners and industrial emulsifiers, have been shown to cause human inflammation due to disruption of the gut microbiome. The idea of a single pathway, top-down nervous system communication from brain to gut has been rewritten. Evidence accumulated over the last 10 years has shown this interaction to be a vibrant, bidirectional communication pathway involving not only vagus and enteric nervous plexus, but hormones and other signaling molecules. It's estimated that 40% of the signaling molecules in a sample of blood at any given time are derived from the gut and the gut microbiome. And the mind-gut axis has been completely redefined. Mindfulness practices are filling in missing pieces and obliterating old ideas. How we eat can measurably impact markers of inflammation. I ask you, during this pandemic, how many of you or your clients or your patients eat takeaway with one hand whilst the other hand operates a cell phone? The importance of how we eat is nothing new, as the story goes. When the ancient Roman politician Lucius Lucilius noticed his night's menu looking a little dull, he gave instructions to his cook to prepare a lavish multiple-course feast. When the cook asked what type of guest to expect, he responded with indignation. "Dost thou know today that Lucilius dines with Lucilius?" In her book, Serve It Forth, the 20th century food writer M.F.K. Fisher described watching an elderly man eating alone with almost religious reverence. He slowly consumed half an avocado sprinkled with powdered sugar and soaked in Russian Kumel liqueur. He was at peace and aware that Lucilius dined with Lucilius for a reason, she wrote. Today, there is simply no separating the qualitative experiential effects of a meal from the development of health and wellness or disability and disease. We are not only what we eat, but how we eat, why we eat, when we eat, and with whom we eat, even if it is just ourselves. These new and rediscovered truths have forced us to seek a fresh course. Culinary medicine shows the way, a way to health and happiness replete with our and our patients' and our clients' favorite foods along the way. A pizza made with organic durum wheat, fresh mozzarella from grass-fed pastured cattle, heirloom organic tomatoes just harvested from their sun-dressed vines and topped with verdant basil from our own windowsill garden. These are the real ingredients that we and our gut microbiome have evolved to thrive upon. So how did we lose our way? Allow me to share how I lost mine. Travel back with me several decades to when I was an extremely busy clinical cardiologist. My partner at the time was Brad, a world-famous interventionalist who trained me as a resident. And when he left university and set up his own practice and research institute, he sought me out to join him. One day, Brad returned from giving a lecture in Southern California, and he asked me to meet him briefly in the back room. Now, I got to admit, I was a bit put out about the whole thing. So he was supposed to have returned to from the conference several days ago. He called me on the night he was supposed to have returned and said he'd be back in a couple of days. And that was it. No explanation, no reason, no apology. As we stood alone in that empty room, I prepared myself to hear some lame excuse to cover up what had invariably been another night of him whining and dining Caligula style on the tab of some pharmaceutical company. And just thinking about it, honestly, was starting to irritate me. Then Brad began his confessional. "Mike," he said softly, "this has to remain just between you and me. The reason I was late coming back was because I had to have a heart catheterization." I heard the words and found myself in a bewilderment, and he must have seen it on my face because he followed up with more explanation. "After I finished my talk at the conference, I started having bad chest pain. I'm a diabetic. Please don't tell anyone about that. But because of my diabetes, I thought I should get a heart cath right away. The great news is my coronary arteries look fine. Everything's fine. I'm fine. So no worries." And with that, he walked out the door and returned to life as usual. But Brad's life, by any measure, was far from normal. Brad himself was a giant of a man. He stood about 6'4", was massively overweight. At that time, Brad was also a rock star amongst other academics, and perhaps more importantly, or more tragically, also a rock star amongst the pharmaceutical and medical device companies with their open checkbooks. Brad dined lavishly at expensive restaurants nearly every night of the week. As a junior partner, also living alone in town at the time, Brad's largesse opened doors for me. For me, being so consumed with work, consuming food became more about convenience than quality. Much more than occasionally, I found myself sitting around the table with a feast fit for a king whilst Brad held court. But unlike Brad, because of my former experience as a professional chef, I knew where the food came from. Meat from concentrated animal feeding operations and out of season vegetables shipped from overseas, all adulterated with processing and additives. And then Brad got sick, real sick. He collapsed at another conference where he was giving a lecture, and he was flown to the Mayo Clinic, where they discovered a small cut on the bottom of his foot had been neglected because as a diabetic, Brad had not felt any discomfort. This had led to an infection that spread to his spine. The infected spinal bone was removed and prosthetics implanted, but in short order, those became infected and they had to be removed. When he awoke from that operation, Brad was a paraplegic. He hadn't been able to return to the catheterization laboratory, to the pursuit of interventional cardiology, a practice that defined his whole person, his raison d'etre, since his collapse. Once the paralysis set in, the end was near. He died an ignominious death, suffocating in a bathtub. And that changed everything for me. Without Brad, the corporate fanfare disappeared. Without their studies and support, the once mighty river of prestige and power and free meals that we had sailed upon became a dry creek bed. But there were lessons there. Under the rocks and beyond the loss and sadness, I found that answers can be unearthed in the most unlikely places and under the most extraordinary circumstances. So I returned to my culinary laboratory, my sanctum sanctorum, and I started doing my research. I went back to the kitchen and rediscovered my love and delight in the ingredients, flavors, and textures of real, authentic food. I reevaluated, reestablished, and reconnected my relationship with the food I eat. That was over 20 years ago. So I'm here today to say it's been a long, strange journey from staring into the best only a decade ago, and an even longer personal journey that saw me stranded and depressed, alone, a lost soul with a lone voice in the wilderness. Yet because of the hard work and tireless efforts of so many researchers and thinkers from widespread fields of scientific study dispersed around the globe, I am here today to share with you this treasure that is culinary medicine. Because it is our mission to help anyone who is confused about health and food. It is our mission to help anyone who loves a good food experience and only asks that the food that they eat not be the poison that kills them. It is our mission to help everyone who honestly examines their relationship with food, not only the food they eat, but the how, the why, the with whom they eat, and says to themselves, it can be better. I can be better. I'm here to tell you that food can be both delicious and nutritious for everyone. There is no salvation in deprivation, but it begins with a relationship grounded in reality, real, authentic, wholesome foods combined in endless combinations of ever-evolving flavor profiles. A juicy, succulent, grass-finished bison burger topped with just from the garden veg is a world apart, both in taste and in health effects, from a takeaway ultra-processed industrial gray meat-like patty. When we finally acknowledge this obvious truth in the formulation of our recommendations and guidelines, only then can we begin to restore the balance between what we eat and who we are. Only then can we begin to restore our diet to its original intent. The original ancient Greek meaning of dietia is a way of living in harmony. In this simple exchange of life between the food we eat and who we are, we set the compass star for all the relationships and all the happiness in our lives. So I invite you to the culinary medicine table. It's a far richer feast than you could have ever imagined. So thank you so much for your attention.
Yes, Dr. Michael, I can say question in the chat box from Dr. Philip. How many culinary medicine schools do exist as of today?
Actually, there are just a few. It's a evolving discipline. And what you'll notice is that there is a wide gamut of what is taught, what is emphasized, and even in terms of the qualifications. So we are a university vetted program. We teach academic credits. We offer the same program to the general public with a certification. But many of the courses that you'll find out there are done with individuals or come from strictly a culinary approach. And so they do not emphasize the same academic rigors as we do. So I would tell folks there are plenty of programs out there, but it's sort of caveat emptor and really use your discretion and discernment when you evaluate the credentials of any particular program.
So I can see one more question. What is the most important thing to prepare delicious and nutritious food?
I would say the most important thing is a large section of what we teach in our introduction course, which I like to call the art of sorcery. So that is really discerning where our food comes from. As I mentioned in the talk, we look and we evaluate things in terms of, let's say, red meat often, but there's a big difference between a concentrated animal feeding operation that uses GMO feed, raises the animal under stress and produces a hamburger versus a heritage breed, pastured cattle that's raised very humanely in an organic, with an organic approach. And so what I have summarized this to is sort of three questions about our food, which is, how is it bred? So is that fish wild caught, or is it raised, in a aquaculture environment? If so, what are the details of the aquaculture environment? What was it fed? Is that a organic vegetable raised naturally, or is it subject to industrial monocrop culture and GMOs and pesticides? And then finally, where was it led? What is the degree, if any, of post-processing? So if we ask those three questions about our ingredients, we can, how is it bred? What was it fed? Where was it led? That can help us source the best ingredients. And that's one of the most critical components before we even begin to cook and prepare our meals.
Thank you very much. And I can see one more question. And he's asking about what is the importance of taking supplements along with food?
That would depend probably on the individual need. So if someone is under additional stress, for example, I before COVID, I used to travel a lot. And travel, as we know, just changing time zones can affect our gut microbiome. So maybe you want to take some probiotics there. As the previous speaker mentioned, if you have joint issues, you might want to take a curcumin supplementation. If we eat a healthy, natural, balanced diet, if we follow culinary medicine principles, I would submit that for most people, the addition of supplements is not a necessary item that they have to put forth in their diet. We have a long standing discussion that goes back and forth in the cardiology literature about the benefit or no benefit of fish oils in terms of reducing cardiovascular risk. And I always tell people, well, what is not under question is take your supplement money and buy a really good salmon fillet and cook it up and enjoy that meal. And you're going to, be on your way to cardiovascular risk. You're going to practice culinary medicine and you save money on supplementation. And I see a note there that the organic approach is not the norm. And no, it's not. And that's why culinary medicine is a quantum shift in perspective. So we have to go back and looking at how our foods are raised and the types of foods and vegetables that we raise. If we look up, we've lost approximately 94% of the world's variability in terms of seed crops because of a monocrop culture approach. What I would submit to you is that as consumers vote with their diet, we can affect change. Walmart is the #1 distributor of organic food in the United States today. And that is not because Walmart cares two hoots about the health of any of us. It's because they know that there is a demand for organic food. And because there is a demand and Walmart can make money selling it, they're going to offer and supply organic food. So, I think that the more of us that pursue that approach, that start to demand those types of foodstuffs and ingredients from the marketplace, and we can get them. And unfortunately now I would agree, with Edgar that they can be more expensive. But, as a chef, I can also tell you that we employ within the culinary medicine course something we call the zero waste culinary kitchen, which is, as a chef, how do I get these quality ingredients, prepare a meal for my customers, and still keep the doors of my restaurant open? And that's a whole separate lecture, but there are tricks and techniques of the industry that we use there to do that. And what food non-vegetarian is to be avoided for cardiovascular disease? Um, Really, whether vegetarian or non-vegetarian, we want to stay away from the highly processed foods. And again, I encourage those of you unfamiliar with the NOVA classification developed by the University of Brazil to explore their wonderful insights, because a vegetarian diet, and I'm sorry to say that I have vegetarian friends who pursue this, is that they go through the drive-through, they get the takeaway, and it's French fries and onion rings, and that's, they say, well, I'm eating vegetarian, so that's very healthful. Well, no, it's not. It's highly processed, adulterated foodstuffs. So whether vegetarian or not, we really want to stay away, particularly from the ultra processed foods. And unfortunately, if we look at the standard American diet, what we find is that about 60% of the diet, well over half of the standard American diet, is composed of ultra processed foodstuffs. And so you heard my allusion to a homemade pizza from, an ancient grain, durum wheat, which is different than modern bread wheat. And you look at that compared to a frozen pizza that is one of the top 10 fast foods that is found in the modern US diet, and it's a source of a tremendous amount of additives. So again, even when we come to something as simple as a pizza, which, by the way, in one form or another has been around for over 2,500 years, going back to ancient Greece. No, they didn't have tomato sauce, but they did have cheese and dough, so I guess a white pizza. And that type of approach to food, when we rediscover and reconnect with our roots, as Aubrey had mentioned in her talk on food as medicine, we connect to a healthier way of eating, and we establish a relationship with our food. And that is critically important as well, beyond just what we pick off the shelf.